What's up guys, it's Ben and Parts here. Welcome back to yet another episode of this Cryptid cast series. I've stopped doing lumberjack cryptids for now, so I thought I'd focus more on, quote, real cryptids. Cryptids that they're not outrageous enough that you think, oh okay, this is certainly a hoax, but at the same time there's not enough evidence associated with them to suggest that they're real either, and some of the evidence is fiercely disputed, which in my opinion makes them more fascinating. And today we have the Partridge Creek monster, a dinosaur. Only not a dinosaur from 65 million years ago, a dinosaur that reportedly lives in the middle of the wilds of Arctic Canada. Now, this is already going to make certain scientists stone me to death just for saying that. So, before people explode in outrage at me, I'm going to say that the evidence linked to this case is fiercely disputed, but I think that's what makes it all the more interesting. So, without further ado, let's get into this story, and let's hopefully not stone me or punch me or write me nasty letters during the course of it. The Partridge Creek monster is a famous sighting of a dinosaur, which at first glance looks more like a T-Rex, but seems actually to be a Ceratosaurus, reported from Partridge Creek in Canada's Yukon in 1908 by multiple witnesses to give it some credibility. The sighting, when reported, went the equivalent of viral back then, especially because dinosaurs had become a very, very recent craze. In 1942, Sir Richard Owen had come up with the term Dinosaurus, or terrible lizard, and when that combined with all the dinosaur sightings being unearthed, people were enraptured by them. Especially when British sculptor Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins built life-size sculptures of 33 dinosaurs based on Owen's fossils. And of course, fictional dinosaur mania exploded. In 1864, French novelist Jules Verne published Journey to the Centre of the Earth, a literary classic in which an eclectic German scientist and his nephew discover an ocean deep beneath Iceland, teeming with aquatic dinosaurs. In 1912, much more famously, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published his novel The Lost World, in which an ambitious reporter accompanies a professor on an expedition to a remote stretch of South America teeming with pterodactyls. A book that was in turn actually based off of real stories of the Curupira Plateau, a plateau in Brazil where a species of Carnotaurus called the stoa is meant to live, where not only have pterosaurs been reported by multiple accounts, but where, according to other people, there's also UFO activity and other mysterious things, but that's a whole other story for another time. The point is that in April 1908, in the French science magazine Je sais tout, an article on the monster of Partridge Creek was published, when this whole story begins. This article was written by a Frenchman called Georges Dupuy, 34-year-old journalist, writer and translator, who had a very eclectic career not only writing on cryptids, mysteries and legends, but also writing about boxers, sprinters and athletes for a sports publication. Dupuy had also written a short story set in the Yukon, a place of which he'd had experience, but more on that later. And Dupuy certainly had experience. He'd travelled all around the world, and even been in America during the gold rush, and during that time, in a Dawson City saloon, he'd met a fellow globe-trotting writer, Jack London, who would later write classics like White Fang and The Call of the Wild. Both men were very similar in nature. Both loved prying people's minds for tales of mysteries, legends and strange experiences, both were intensely creative, and both were intensely curious of the world. London remembered Mr. Georges Dupuy as a Frenchman, an artist, a journalist, and a man who knows Alaska better than I do. He has lived the life. I called him an artist, and by the word, I mean not painter, but temperament. He sees. From my talks with him, I see that he has the romance, the fire, the colour, the idiom of the land. So Dupuy, for all intents and purposes, is a credible witness, which takes us to his account. I'm going to read you all of Mr. Dupuy's full article, only adding minimal commentary. For the purposes of not being cancelled, can I also add the disclaimer that any hints of racial views are not my own. Without further ado, and hopefully with no stoning, I give you Monsieur Dupuy. The story which follows is in no sense of romance. I wish in the first place to ask the readers of the following narrative to believe that I am in no way attempting to impose upon their credulity. Concerning the amazing spectacle I am about to describe, I report nothing but plain facts, however astounding and however incredible they may seem at first glance, precisely as they happened according to my own eyes, and I am possessed of excellent sight, and to those of my three companions, all three white men, without counting 5 Indians of the Claicook tribe, who have their camps on the shore of the River Stewart. The following are the names of the 3 ocular witnesses who are ready to testify for the truth of my assertions. The first is my hunting companion for many years, Mr. James Lewis Butler, banker of San Francisco. The second is Mr. Tom Lamore, miner from Western River in the Yukon County. And lastly, the Reverend Father Pierre Lavagneau, a Canadian Frenchman and missionary at the Indian village of Armstrong Creek, not far from McQueston. In the course of 10 years rambling in the 4 quarters of the world, it has been a lot to witness a great number of amazing spectacles, and the strange experience of which I speak had become no more than a vivid recollection when a few days ago, on January 24th, 1908, the following letter reached me at Paris. It came from Father Lavenu, who passed his life with his savage flock 600 miles northwest of the Klondike. I give it here word for word. Here is the letter that Mr. Dupuy claims to have received. Armstrong Creek, January 1st, 1908. My dear son, the trader of McQueston has just stopped here with his train of logs and sledges. He has had a hard journey from Dawson by Barlow, Flat Creek and Dominion. I expect to receive him in another fortnight. Fresh provisions and news of the outside world. Today is the first day of the new year, and I want this letter to express my affectionate wishes for your health and happiness. I hope it will give me the pleasure of receiving you under my humble roof, here at the other end of the earth. I will not believe that you will let your old friend in the great north leave his old carcass to the Indians, who will some day or other make a coffin out of branches, without seeing him once more. I have received your book, the reading of which has given me the greatest pleasure. By the way, you are wrong at me in regard to that poor fellow John Spitz. Alas, he is no longer mail carrier of the Duncan district. He died, poor fellow, at Eagle Camp, soon after you departed, not having received the wound he received from the bald face, which you will remember. Talking of ferocious animals, will you believe me when I tell you that 10 of my Indians and myself saw again, on Christmas Eve, that horrible beast of Partridge Creek passing like a whirlwind over the frozen surface of the river, breaking off with his hind feet enormous blocks of ice from the rough surface? His fur was covered with hoarfrost, and his little eyes gleamed like fire in the twilight. The beast held in his jaws something which seemed to be a caribou. It was moving at a rate of more than 10 miles an hour. The temperature that day was 45 degrees below zero. At the corner of the cut-off, it disappeared. It is undoubtedly the same animal that we saw before. Accompanied by Chief Steinshane and 2 of his sons, I followed the traces, which were exactly like those that we all saw. Lemur, Butler, you and I, in the mud of the Moose Lick. 6 times, on the snow, we were able to measure the impression of its enormous body, the same size as we found it before, almost to the 20th of an inch. We followed them to Stewart, fully 2 miles, when the snow began to fall slightly and bottled it out the trees. Mr. Dupuy then claims, and I quote, "It was on receipt of this letter that I decided to write the story of my own experience, which it recalled so vividly to mind, and of which it afforded a striking confirmation." The station of McQueston, that far-off corner of the strange country of the Yukon, where the 8 months of winter are so terrible, but the short summer so marvellously beautiful, was on 4 occasions my chosen retreat during the 8 years that I have known the North. A friend of mine in San Francisco, Mr. Butler, who had come to Dawson City in order to produce a coal mining concession, had promised to join me in order that we should go hunting together. I was taking my coffee one afternoon in the veranda of Father Lavenue's cabin, when all at once I heard someone whistle from the riverbank of the river. A bark canoe, paddled by 2 Indians, was coming up the river in the shadow of the trees. Butler was with them. "My dear fellow," he said, smiling as I met him and endeavouring to hide his visible agitation, "I have something strange to tell you. Do you know that prehistoric monsters still exist?" I broke out laughing, and together we returned by the little path which led to the father's house. When Butler had taken off his muddy boots and was ensconced in a comfortable seat, he began to recount his story as follows. Leaving Gravel Lake, where I arrived on Tuesday evening, my last stage was the mouth of Clear Creek, where I knew that you would send someone to meet me. Travelling was frightfully bad, 40 miles of marshy country. At last, at nightfall, I descended a hill, and had the pleasure of seeing Grant's cabin, which was lighted up. Grant was at home, and a good supper was waiting for me. Early the next morning, he came to tell me, in his reserved and silent manner, that 3 fine moose were feeding quietly behind the plateau of Partridge Creek. After swallowing a hasty mouthful, all 4 of us, Grant, your 2 men and I, started out from the hut. We made a wide detour. At the top of a hill, where we had hidden ourselves, all of us stretched full length on the ground, we perceived, a short distance off in the valley near a moose lick, 3 enormous moose, moving slowly forward and quietly browsing on the moss and lichens. All at once, they gave 3 simultaneous bounds, and one of the males giving vent to the striking bellow, which these 3 animals utter only when they are hunted or mortally wounded, the 3 went off at a mad gallop toward the south. What had happened? What did Dupuy then claim they did next? In his own words, "We decided to approach the spot where the animals had taken fright so suddenly. Arriving at the Moose Lick, a spot about 60 feet long and 15 wide, we saw in the mud, and almost on the level of the water with the lick, the fresh impression of the body of a monstrous animal. Its belly had made an impression in the slime more than 2 feet deep, 30 feet long and 12 feet wide. 4 gigantic paws, also deeply impressed, had left at each end of the main imprint, and a little to the side, footprints 5 feet long by 2.5 feet wide, the claws being more than a foot long, the sharp points of which had buried themselves deeply in the mud. There was also the print, apparently, of a heavy tail, 10 feet long and 16 inches wide. We followed the tracks of the monster in the direction of the valley for 5 or 6 miles, and then, at the ravine of Partridge Creek, a place which the miners call a gulch, they ceased suddenly, as if by enchantment. The next day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, Father Lavagneau, Butler, Lemore, a neighbouring miner hastily summoned, myself and 5 men of the tribe, crossed the River Stewart in 2 canoes. Neither of the first 2 guides, who were overcome with terror, nor the sergeant of the mounted police, who received our story with scepticism, nor the letter carrier, would consent to accompany us. All day long we searched, without result, the valley of the little river McKeston, the flats of Partridge Creek and the county Bethune Barlow and the lofty snow-covered mountains. At last, toward evening, tired out, after having toiled for a long time through the great marsh, we lighted a fire at the top of a rocky ravine. The sun was setting. Lying by the fire, we let our eyes wander over the glittering expanse of marsh which we had just traversed. The tea was boiling, and everyone was preparing to dip into his tin cup in the pot, when suddenly a noise of rolling stones and a strange, harsh and frightful roar made us all spring to our feet. The beast for which we had been looking, a black, gigantic form, the corners of his mouth filled with blood-stained slime, his jaws munching something, I know not what, was slowly and heavily climbing the opposite side of the ravine, making the large boulders roll into the valley as he went. Struck with terror, Father Lavagneau, Lemore and myself tried to utter a cry of fright, but no sound issued from our parched throats. Unconsciously, we had seized each other's arms. The 5 Indians were crouching down with their faces against the ground, trembling like leaves shaken by the wind. Butler was also rushing down the hill. "The Dinosaurus! It's the Dinosaurus of the Arctic Circle," muttered Father Lavagneau, with chattering teeth. The monster had stopped scarcely 20 paces from us, and resting upon his huge belly, was staring motionless at the red sun, which was bathing all the landscape in a weird light. For a full 10 minutes, riveted to the spot by some strange force which we could not overcome, did we contemplate this terrible apparition. We were, however, in full possession of our senses. There was not, and never will be, in our minds, the least doubt as to the reality of what we saw. It was indeed a living creature, and not an illusion we had before us. The Dinosaurus then turned his immense neck, but did not seem to see us. His withers were at least 18 feet above the ground. His entire body, from the extremity of his yawning jaws, which were surmounted by a horn like that of a rhinoceros, to the end of the tail, must have measured at least 50 feet. His hide was like that of a wild boar, garnished with thick bristles, in colour a greyish-black. His belly was plastered with thick mud. At this moment, Butler returned to us. He told us that he thought the animal weighed about 30 tons. Suddenly, the Dinosaurus moved his jaws, visibly chewing some thick, viscid kind of food, and we heard a sound like that of the crunching of small bones. Then, with a sudden movement, he raised himself on his hind legs, and giving utterance to a roar, a hollow, indescribable, frightful sound, and wheeling round with surprising agility, with movements resembling that of a kangaroo, he sprang with a prodigious bound into the ravine. On the 24th, Butler and myself, having taken 2 days' rest, started for Dawson City, for the purpose of demanding from the governor 50 armed men and mules. Here my story ends. For a month we were the laughing-stock of the Golden City, and the Dawson Daily Nugget published an article about me, which was at the same time flattering and satirical, entitled A Rival of Poe. So this is the incredible story of Dupuy, and it's written very, very well. I have to say, as a fellow author, it's incredible to read. It gets the heckles up on the back of your neck, to say the least. This is where some people become suspicious and say it's fiction, because 2 years earlier, Dupuy had written a French-language story called Un drame au Klondike, or A Drama in the Klondike, about a French-Canadian gold prospector who murdered 2 people to get their gold, only to be driven away from his prize at the 11th hour by the vengeful sled dogs. Some people have also claimed it must be fictional because Dupuy identifies the Indians of the Stewart River as members of the Clycook tribe. However, the natives of the Stewart River are members of the Northern Tutchone First Nation, and none of them go by the name Clycook. There are Koyukuk Indians, however, who are members of a subdivision of the Koyukon Nation, but who have a homeland far from the Stewart River. Some people wonder if Dupuy's inclusion of the so-called Clayoquot Indians in his narrative, considering his intimate familiarity with the North Country, was basically him trolling the public, sending a wink and a nod to his close friends, who would have instantly noticed the error unlike the public. And very damningly, we have to remember that Dupuy's friend Jack London not only talked about his active imagination, but also did a similar thing with his novel, The Call of the Wild, which mentioned the absolutely fictitious Yeehat Indians, a name that just makes me laugh, and I'm sure would have got him cancelled by Native Americans today. In addition to the things that some people think are red flags for a hoax, the notion that a carnivorous, cold-blooded huge dinosaur like the Ceratosaurus could survive in the freezing Yukon of Canada has been widely rubbished by a lot of people. English naturalist Richard Lydekker wrote, That a living representative of the carnivorous dinosaurs of the secondary epoch should be living in the frozen north of Alaska seems incredible to every scientific mind. The prima facie presumption is that the larger dinosaurs were inhabitants of warm, rather than of Arctic zones. Even British cryptozoologist Carl Schucker, often known to suspend his cryptozoological disbelief, wrote in his book In Search of Prehistoric Survivors that the monster of Partridge Creek merits a prominent place among the dubitanda of cryptozoology, bearing in mind that the existence of such an animal calls for our belief in a post-Cretaceous persistence of an endothermic hairy dinosaur in which it was surely be the last compatible habitat for any type of living reptile living today. Its lack of cryptozoological credibility should hardly come as a great surprise. Some people also think that it's very, very convenient that the species of dinosaurs seen just happened to be one of the very few species of dinosaurs known back in 1908, and was also said to drag its tail, and the dragging of the tail was widely thought what the Ceratosaurus did in 1908, but which is now known almost certainly to be false. However, we have never even seen dinosaurs in their natural environment. We have no idea how we really were, and this rubbishing also isn't taking evolution into account. And evolution is proving my optimism right, because dinosaur fossils have been discovered not only in the Arctic, but also in the Antarctic. The Lielanosaurus was a thing, the Koolasuchus was a thing, and the polar allosaur, a creature with horny ridges on its nose, a literal bipedal dinosaur predator, was also a thing, which even leaves open the possibility that this could have been some kind of enlarged version of that. Also, the dinosaur was seen as having feathers, something nobody knew dinosaurs had back in 1908, and which is ironically quite accurate, and these feathers could have been insulation. Could not some of these dinosaurs, many of which no doubt already had feathers, have grown more due to living in colder climates? Furthermore, in 1922 there were very Ceratosaurus-like cryptids reported in the cold Arctic Kamchatka Peninsula of the Soviet Union. Although evidence is scarce, it's claimed indigenous hunters actually found the remains of a young Ceratosaurus-like creature, then brought back its severed foot. Is this some kind of cousin of the Partridge Creek Ceratosaurus? It has to be remembered that the Kamchatka and Chukotka regions were once linked to Alaska by an unbroken stretch of ice. Furthermore, remember how people said the stoa, on the border of Brazil and Venezuela, another bipedal predator, was just a hoax, yet Conan Doyle had heard stories of it, Yaroslav Maresh had heard stories of it, and the natives had heard stories of it? Furthermore, it isn't like this was the only report of the sighting. In the 1930s, Canadian writer, another writer, and former Hudson Bay Company inspector Philip H. Godsell, a very respected man, wrote many articles in which he discussed his friend Frank Beaton supposedly having heard a story from a scientific party, one of whose native guides had told him a tale. Some years before, the guide's father had travelled to the Yukon and hung out with the tribe of the Dene Indians. Around their fires, Godsell claimed, these Stone Age people had told him of Medicine Valley to the north, inhabited by monsters of fearful size and ferocity. Furthermore, one of the natives produced a piece of buckskin that he depicted one of the monsters on. This skin was eventually given by the guide to the scientific party, and although it doesn't exist today that we know of, supposedly showed an absolutely flawless depiction of a carnivorous dinosaur. So what do you guys think? Do you think it's a real cryptid? Do you think it's a hoax? Do you think people are seeing something real and they have some kind of misconception? I know a lot of people are saying that, oh, it couldn't have existed, it probably didn't exist at all, it would have to have been in a different environment. But things evolve all the time and stranger discoveries have been made. People thought the coelacanth, a giant fish, was extinct for 65 million years, then someone just hauled one up off the coast of South America in 1938. Creatures can adapt, creatures can survive, creatures can change, and although I agree that a lot of the evidence is kind of dubious, I'm open to the possibilities exists. But what do you guys think? Do any of you know any stories of it? Do any of you know anyone who's seen it? Do you have any relatives who have any encounters? Please drop that in the comments section below. That always generates an interesting dialogue. Please stay tuned for my new Flying Saucer podcast, which is coming soon and is going to include everything from alleged conspiracies and cover-ups to sightings and crash retrievals. Stay tuned for my new podcast on spirits, which is also dropping soon, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in the next episode.